All right, well, so there's two talks. Tomorrow I'll give a more technical talk. Today I thought, Tucker said, well, do something more general, something maybe out of the box, something different. And so I thought I'd talk about this. What I've done could broadly be termed landscape ecology research through time, and the arc of one career, mine in this case. From Wisconsin family woodlot, I grew up in Wisconsin, to having spent my adult life as an applied ecologist in the mountains of northern New Mexico, and to ending up the last 15 or so years taking this really deep place-based knowledge from that part of the world at the south end of the Rocky Mountains, and turned out it became relevant at a global scale. And I thought it might be interesting for this audience. I am pretty applied. It's one of the reasons I like Utah State and a lot of the folks that work here. But a lot of you who are graduate students, there was no crystal ball. There was no plan. These, like for most people, there's these forks in the road and you have to pick and choose and take something. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the arc of this particular one. So there's really no way to get rid of this bank. I really would like this one off if somebody knows how to do that, because I'm a visual person and I put an effort into the slides. It's a lot better if you can see them. Yeah, let's go with experience here. Yeah. Yay. We can do the whole show. All right, thank you. Thank you very much.
I didn't do it.
You looked at it. That was all it took. It took at it. So. All right, so I grew up in Wisconsin, there on this big, beautiful planet, which you can see a little better here. And a place that looks a lot like this, a diverse mix of farms and forests and water and lake. These are my parents. They met in high school a little bit north of Green Bay. They both grew up in rural areas from farming families. My dad taught high school biology about an hour southeast, a town called Manitowoc, Wisconsin, on the shores of Lake Michigan. I grew up a block from the big lake. And his biology teacher and a nurse couldn't figure out how to stop having kids. They had 6 kids in 9 years. I was the oldest of these 6 kids. And there we are about a decade ago. And my dad. And these things proliferate. Something about biology. You guys know about how this works, right? So this is with, married, and they have 13 grandchildren. So a little bit about my grandparents. This is about place. This talk, to some extent, about place-based. I spent my adult life based in New Mexico, but I was very based here in northeastern Wisconsin. My grandparents, that's my grandmother on my mother's side. She's 103 right now. 4 years ago, she was still living on this farm, having outlived 2 husbands. And she's still actually fun to talk to. I spent a lot of time up there. It was with forest and brook. This is my grandfather on my father's side. I learned a lot from him. He didn't have a whole lot of formal schooling. 3 of the grandparents, including him, did finish high school back in the day. But I spent a lot of time outdoors with him. He was a very important person in my life, as was my father in a similar way. And when I was 12, my grandfather bought this 40-acre woodlot half mile down the road, or closer to a mile down the road from the family farm he grew up on Allen Road, near Little Swamico. He brought this. He was a rural mail carrier at the time, and some local farmer was grumbling when he was delivering the mail about even paying the taxes on this worthless 40-acre swampy woodlot. And my grandpa said, "What do you want for it?" And he said, "I don't know, $500. And Grandpa said, "I can come up with that." So he bought this thing. It had been cut over at least 3 times since Euro-American settlement in the mid-1800s. Somebody had tried to live out there in the Depression. You could still see the remains of this stuff. Anyway, ever since then, this was kind of our Sand County Almanac place, a place where we, without even knowing it, learned to appreciate this piece of land and restore it, doing lots of different kinds of things. We transplanted wildflowers in, planted lots of trees. Here's my mother and my daughter when she'd be, 3-ish there, so that would have been about 1989. This is the one big tree, the biggest tree on the place, a big pin oak. Same tree, actually. And a Leopold quote, "There's hardly an acre that does not tell its own story to those who understand the speech of hills and rivers." So, Leopold. We make maple syrup out there in the spring. The trees we make syrup from today were saplings. There was one section that had a few older. They're actually red maples, not sugar maples, because it's kind of wet and low. Stuff grows fast there, though. So, brothers and father. So, and again, sort of the classic. Everybody in here has probably read or heard this quote, right? "A thing is right when it tends to conserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community." So this was something that we kind of, without even knowing it, we were doing it. Meanwhile, when I went to school, so I did my bachelor's and master's at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Without realizing it, my first year, I took a physical geography course, physical systems of the environment. And what I realized was that I'd been all my life, without even knowing it, trying to understand what it was I was seeing when I look at a landscape. And it was all of a sudden, oh my gosh, and here are some of the lenses to look through it and filter it and understand it better. And anyway, that kind of clicked. And so I've actually been doing it since I was a kid, just looking out the car window. But I've been doing it formally since I was, 19 or so, thinking about it, learning, studying. And so I've been doing that for my life. A few people have been really important along the way. This is Francis Hole, who led the state soil survey in Wisconsin, walked over most of the state surveying it, but he was a professor in the soil science and geography departments, and he taught the geography of Wisconsin. And I had the distinct pleasure of TAing for him, being a teaching assistant for him the last 3 semesters, the last 3 falls that he taught that. And he had this chaotic quest to have a state soil named. At the time, there were no state soils. And he had a sponsor in the House, but he didn't have one in the Senate. And his the last year, the very last lecture he gave, I had T-shirts made. He'd give these lectures. He played the violin. And anyway, I could sing this song for you. This is the Anago Silt Loam Saw. This is the state soil of Wisconsin. Nebraska ended up beating Port Francis to the punch, but we did get it through. But I learned a lot about this man, who was a conscientious objector in World War II. He was a Quaker. And just... he's as close to a hero, I think, as I have in my life, in terms of somebody who really valued life and relationships of all sorts, human and the world and humans and each other. So through 1979, we didn't travel much with the family. I didn't have that, so I didn't see a whole lot of the big wide world other than through National Geographic pages and encyclopedias and things like that. But so I got to the university, the world started to get bigger. And since 81, it turns out I've been there. 82, I started collecting data. I was scouting in 81. Been in this landscape. This has been my home since then. This is the Jemez Mountains. It's a mountain range at the south end of the Rockies. So from Wisconsin to there, it's that little bump the arrow is pointing to. Here's zooming in. This is the Rio Grande coming in from... basically runs north to south through a rift valley from southern Colorado all the way down to El Paso. And I've been based here in the southeast flank at a park unit, Bandler National Monument, since then. Well, not since then, but continuously since 1986. And this is what I've been doing. Place-based ecology and applied conservation work, working co-located with land managers since then. And especially the last 20 years, climate's been part of the equation. So the effects of climate on various kinds of disturbance processes associated with forests in particular. It's a modest mountain range in the sense there's a 5,000-foot elevational gradient from the Rio Grande at the foot up to peaks that, well, actually up to almost 6,000 feet. It is 6,000 feet, actually, in total gradient there. Just across the way, though, the gradient is 8,000 feet. So on the other side, the south end of the Front Range, it ends at Santa Fe. So these are the Sangre de Cristo Mountains there. Anyway, it's Lake Utah. This is called the same stuff as the Colorado Plateau. Sits there, it underlies the Jemez. The Jemez is kind of a big volcanic bump that punched up through that. Anyway, this has become home to me, these landscapes, and it's truly, it's been a privilege and a pleasure to live and work here as a place-based ecologist all these years, and doing what we can. And how did this happen? So that's what I'm going to talk about, the arc of how this thing happened a little bit more, the accidents of history. So in '76, in June, the month I graduated from high school, my paternal grandparents moved from Little Swamico, Wisconsin, to Bisbee, Arizona, on the Mexican border, south of Tucson, because their daughter, my aunt, lived out there, and she thought it would be good for them, and somehow, it's amazing, that my grandparents grew up on adjoining farms. Their parents were best friends. They were the same age. They knew each other from infancy. They lived their entire life there in northeast Wisconsin. And at age 65, their daughter talked them into moving to Bisbee, to this mining town whose economy had collapsed. They didn't have any money, but they could afford a tiny little house there from one of the miners. They moved there. I was really close to them, especially my grandfather. So I started coming down to the Southwest. And, sorry, I went back. And then on the way back, I took the spring semester as a junior. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, like many people. I needed to declare a major. I had one, but I wasn't sure if I wanted it or not. And so I took the semester off and spent the spring with my both sets of grandparents because I wanted to spend more time. And I spent a couple months down in Bisbee. And on the way back, stopping through Espanola, which is a little town, 400 years old at the foot of the Jemez, I ended up volunteering at a school. I was going to stay for 2 weeks, ended up staying for the spring, and at the end of it, fell in love with a school teacher there. And all of a sudden, here I am in northern New Mexico, learning this place, and on the weekends, people are taking me out to the mountains. So I started to learn about these mountain ranges here. Went back, ended up marrying the school teacher, but she came back to Wisconsin. I entered grad school in '80 in the geography department. Needed a thesis topic, so I come out, poking around in the summer of 1981, trying to find something in these mountains. That's all I knew. I wanted to do something out here, because I was starting to like it out here, and had this secondary attachment as well through my wife. And started to work on these high-elevation grasslands that interrupt forest zones, mixed conifer forest zones. The Jemez are not high enough. 11,500 is the highest mountain. Tree line locally is 12,000 feet. There's nothing that's above tree line, yet there's these distinctive on the south-facing slopes, these big grasslands. And I got a lot of different stories about they're as old as the mountain range, 1 million years older. No, it was a crown fire 200 years ago and whatever. So I said, great, topic, nobody knows. So I worked on these things and cored hundreds of trees and dug soil pits and put together a story about it. It turns out they're really old. They've got prairie soils that would look good in Iowa, under tallgrass prairie, 1 meter of A-horizon, mollic epipedons, but they're at 40% slopes at 10,000 feet. So you're talking on the order of thousands of years to get these. Probably related to the fire histories. Probably a lot of them formed actually early in the Holocene, when probably there were big stand-replacing fires. But anyway, so I worked on that. And then some other things happened along the way. Almost went into the Peace Corps, didn't get a good assignment, so plan B was to go back and work on forest landscape ecology. And I had a plan to work in southern Mexico, in Oaxaca. And actually had a Fulbright and spent a month down there the summer of '85 and had a project all worked out in the Sierra de Juarez on the drainage divide between Oaxaca and Veracruz, cool, temperate, tropical mix. And then that fall, we got pregnant with my daughter 2 months later. And there was a very massive earthquake in southern Mexico. And my colleagues in Mexico said, it's kind of a messy, difficult time. It was a super remote area. It would have been a difficult place to have been a new parent. I said, I don't want to start out being that way. So I needed a new plan. So I went back to the Jemez to Bandelier, who I had done some seasonal work for them and some contract work, and talked them into supporting 6 months at a time a PhD project looking at changes in the whole landscape, not just in the park but around it, in the whole larger landscape, putting the park in that context. This was my major professor at Berkeley, Arnold Schultz, who, I won't say too much about Arnold. He wasn't publishing very much the last 20 years of his life, but he cared a lot about making the world a better place. He kind of picked me more than I picked him. I just applied to the department. And there was some idealism that linked. And anyway, I benefit a lot from Arnold. But he was a kind of holistic ecological thinker, but it wasn't in a quantitative way these days. Anyway, I worked on an early landscape ecology project when you did map things by hand on light tables and stereo photos of many different phenomena. There were 1935 air photos. So I mapped a lot of things from 1935 to the 1981 was the latest set of comprehensive photos. And while doing that, I sat in the office of the resource manager at the park. This is an archaeological park, which I'll show you a little bit about in a minute. But they never really had any kind of natural resource work done there. A little bit done in the 70s related to feral burrows, but it was all contract. And a little bit contracted with fire after a big fire in 77, which was sort of the first hints of change in that landscape we'll talk more about. Anyway, as I was getting close to being done, I'd made myself useful enough that the superintendent and the resource manager said, yeah, if you're interested, one of the maintenance people is retiring. We have lots of maintenance people. We have never had an ecologist. We could take that position and call it an ecologist position. What do you think? And I said, well, I still liking it here. So I did that. So it wasn't a permanent position, but that's how it started. So you're looking at a lapsed maintenance worker position from Bandelier. Who knew? So we moved. So what happened is I went to Berkeley and worked with Arnold for 2 years. I had a lot of coursework from Madison. So, and my master's was quite rigorous. Worked with a guy, Tom Vail was actually my major professor there, who I learned a lot from Tom. And I got to Berkeley and I was ready to, there was stuff I was interested in learning yet, but I was trying to get done there quickly. I had a fellowship, I moved through it quickly. So in 2 years I finished the coursework and the exams. And in Labor Day weekend of 1986, my daughter was 2 months old. We put all our stuff in a moving van and moved to Bandelier, where for the next 11 years I actually lived in the park. And I've been there continuously ever since. No plan, it's just what happened. So in 89, so I finished in May of 89 and was hired in June of 89. The dissertation work looked at all different kinds, as many different lines of evidence as possible, which is kind of my basic philosophy about lots of things and why I've gravitated to things like geography and ecology, because they don't put such hard boundaries on how you look at things. Back to, like, in middle school and high school, you take those little, what is it you're interested in doing things? Scientist, I'm sure I never checked those boxes. So, I want to be a scientist someday. My idea of that is, some person in a white lab coat, it sounded rather boring to me. The idea that you could do this kind of stuff was like, well, as I learned this, it became appealing. So this is the road networks in 1935. That's the road networks in 1981. So I mapped those things by hand off the air photos. And at the time, this was cool work. GIS, the GIS we were running on was at Los Alamos National Laboratory, sits right next to Bandelier. In fact, that's what all this is. Bandelier is this unroaded area here. This is Los Alamos National Laboratory and paved roads. These are the two towns of Los Alamos and White Rock, and all this is the infrastructure to these dispersed technical areas over a 30,000-acre lab site. Los Alamos is where the Manhattan Project, first atomic bomb, was developed. Some really interesting contrasts in this landscape of cultures and things. Mapped this it's kind of a little incidental thing I noticed along the way, but the shifting of this ecotone, the Ponderosa pine zone died back during the severe drought of the 1950s. Not just here, but elsewhere in the region, but I documented it pretty well in my dissertation. And later, we'll skip this because we'll run out of time, but this is a newspaper headline from 1957, and this could be from anywhere in the West in the last 20 years, right? Forest threatened by bark beetle invasion. And actually, just to back up this story, what I saw when I was out there working on this landscape were all these dead Ponderosa pine trees. Not many of them were still standing, laying on the ground in pinyon juniper woodland. And I asked people, well, what's that about? And they said, oh yeah, there was a windstorm, I think, in the 60s. I go, really? And no, it was the 50s drought killed these trees, and you could map it off the air photos because these ponderosas would stick up, so when you're looking in stereo. And then you could date, later we dated them, and they died in the mid-50s with the drought. But people knew it at the time. They knew it was drought-induced, and they knew there were things like bark beetles involved. And but just people forgot, right? Knowledge turns over through time. Never, by the way, somebody was working on this, but I could never find it. They were funding, Forest Service funding some student at UNM, but they must not have ever finished. But anyway, millions of acres being killed from Santa Fe to Taos to Albuquerque to the Jemez around Los Alamos. People forgot about it, and then things got wetter again, and forests got quite dense. This, people along the way, so there are a few of these kind of stories. This is Dave Brashears, about 15 years ago. Dave grew up in Los Alamos. His father was a staff scientist there, and this would be about 2003 or 4, and this was an early tree killing experiment that Dave put in at Los Alamos. So he was working at Los Alamos. He's, 5 years or so younger than I, and he came in. I didn't know him. He was away at Colorado State working on his PhD, and he comes back and he reads my dissertation, and he says, oh, this tree dieback story from the 50s drought, you got to publish this thing. I hadn't published anything in those days because I had several small kids, as you'll see, and so I was doing that. And it wasn't really part of my job description initially. Anyway, Dave and I started working together in the late 90s, and he prodded me to publish this little story. I needed another 2 years to map it at higher resolution to be happy about being able to tell a good story. But in 98, we got that figure published as part of a paper in PNAS and sort of trying to raise the profile of a big, fast ecotone shift. As much as 2 kilometers in less than 5 years of dieback directionally of the lower fringes of the Ponderosa pine zone, which meshes with the projections of climate change effects on vegetation distributions. That's why it was an interesting story and not just a local anecdote. Anyway, Dave's been ever since, for whatever that is now, 30 years. 20 years, a good colleague partner. Anyway, but this is a little side note. This is like sometimes stuff works and sometimes it doesn't. So Dave said, well, I want to do an experiment about, how much, they had long-term measurements on plant water stress here at Los Alamos on these pinon trees. And so he went out in 2001, so in fall of 2001, he gets this project right near their lab space, and this is sewer liner. It's big, heavy-duty plastic, and they coated it, and this is big PVC pipes with air things so that the roots could still get oxygen. They were trying to exclude water, and they put that down in the fall, late fall of 2001, and there was no snow that winter. And this has already been dry for several years, since 2000. So, in fact, maybe it was probably started even earlier in the fall. And in the summer of 2002, in the spring, his plant water potentials go below the cavitation thresholds, and these trees all start dying on and off the plot. He had control plots off of this. Absolutely the same. Nothing, because his timing was, no way to predict it, but his timing was off. So the only thing he got out of it, he did get an interesting thing with junipers. He did get one little paper about 6 years later that junipers can absorb some water through the foliage. Okay, but anyway, that was an early experiment. But Dave's been a good colleague, and we've kind of prodded each other to do some things through the years. Worked a lot from the early, and I'll show photos later of 2 key people involved, but from 1984 on, I've been doing fire history work with tree rings. And at first I did some relatively crude stuff, ring counts on my own, and then I started working with Tom Swetnam's group at the Tree Ring Lab with real dendrochronologists who can date stuff well. I'm good at finding the material and interpreting it, but that's another skill set. But anyway, so built this network through time that started in the 80s across this 1 million-acre field of view you're looking at here. And this was the resource manager at Bandelier, who was kind of like the entryway in. And this is John Lissaway. And his thing was, he actually had a forestry degree. He was a Vietnam vet, got shot up a bit in Nam, got a job with the Park Service in 75 or 6, and he learned fire along the way. So fire kind of became his thing. And so he was, of course, interested in these fire history studies and the vegetation change associated with that. So it was part of why he was supportive. And by the way, I should tell, and John's still not just kicking, he's still doing well. He's in Santa Fe these days, and I see him from time to time. He wasn't real good with book learning kind of stuff, but he was good with people, and he did have a sense of stuff that was important. But he told an anecdote that I remember about generalists, specialists, and resource managers. And he was a resource manager, so he said he could tell this. So he said there's 3 kinds of people working out here in the woods. There's generalists, there's specialists, and there's resource managers. The generalists start out, and they know a little bit about a lot. And they learn less and less about more and more, till pretty soon they know nothing about everything. Then there's the specialists. They start out, and they know a lot about a little. And they learn more and more about less and less, until pretty soon they know everything about nothing. And then there's the poor resource managers, who don't know anything about anything because of their dependence upon generalists and specialists. You might think about where you are in that spectrum. As applied ecologist, I'm probably more in the generalist spectrum, but with a few little areas where we try to have some depth of knowledge. So fire is one of the things I got into. This is very early on, dumb young ecologist trying to use a fusee on the rock, trying to start a fire, playing for the camera. But there's a Smokey Bear Museum in Capitan in southern New Mexico where the little cub was found. So anyway, I snuck into the exhibit and had a friend take a picture of me in there, So from 89, starting in summer of 89, I'm in this term position, which means a temporary position but has benefits with the Park Service, supporting land managers there. My daughter was pushing 3, and so from 2 months on, she lived in this park. She grew up here, learned to walk, and for her, it was home. That month of June of 89, I filed my dissertation in May, got the new job in early June, and in late June, we adopted 2 twin 3-month-old boys from Fort Worth. And we thought we knew what we were doing as parents. We had almost a 3-year-old. It was a big job. Twins is another whole thing. They grew up there. So those boys spent their, the next, whatever that would have been, next 8 years, 8.5 years there. So anyway, they grew up there. This was a wonderful time, and it was a great place to live in terms of being place-based. Living and working in the place, I could walk or bicycle to the office, and there they are, grown up. People, meanwhile, so this is 1989, I'm hired, the park, there's this resource manager, John Lissaway, and there's no staff. There was an archaeologist who John took under his wing. He was taking in the misfit children of the thing. John had good people skills, right? So another guy who was a sniper in Vietnam who was a little bit of a head case, and he was a maintenance worker, didn't get along with the maintenance division, but he had a master's in Paleo-Indian archaeology, which is not the archaeology there. But John said, okay, I'll take him. He became the first archaeologist at the park. There was a law enforcement ranger who couldn't get along with the head law enforcement officer. The same thing. John took the guy and they turned him into a natural resource specialist. He wasn't very good, but those positions became the next generation of people that filled those positions were super good. And anyway, in the 90s, and then in 1990, so a year after I got that job, this man came, Roy Weaver, as superintendent. He had a forestry degree from Colorado State, grew up in Grand Junction, He was expecting his first Park Service job had been a seasonal at Bandelier, and his career goal was to get to Bandelier again. And he came as superintendent. It was going to be his last job. He cared about natural resources, and all he wanted to do was the right thing. All he had to do was, he was direct, he was honest, he was refreshing and a pleasure to work for. In a year after he came, John, the fire guy, had been the resource specialist. They started creating dedicated fire positions. John said, yeah, that's what I want to do. He took the fire management officer position, and he hired Charisse Sidoriak from Yosemite, who had started the first fire monitoring. She was leading of the first fire monitoring program in the Park Service, which the Sierra Nevada Parks started there. It's FMH plots. Some of you probably work with some of those data. Charisse came, and Charisse was spectacular building programs. And then they had this wonky ecologist dude here who helped make the substance of the proposals they did solid to cutting edge. And so we started to be able to compete for funding with even big parks in the Park Service, and built the staff, a whole series of people here as a veg specialist, a wildlife biologist, an archaeologist, people working on historic structures. They built the staff, and here, Kay Bealey, I hired her in 1992. She had been working for Charisse, and we said, well, if we want to really have a stronger ecology program, there's too much data, and training interns every year to collect the same data, that's not my best thing to do. I'm not patient enough. Kay's great at this. So Kay came in summer of 1992, and she and I are still working together. But the next year, in 1993, there was a big change. So anyway, there was a fluorescence. The big point of this is these people together, we built a major park-level natural and cultural resource management program at little bitty Bandelier, 33,000 acres. But with an interesting 5,000-foot elevational gradient, 3,000 recorded arc sites by now. They weren't at that time. They were still needed to be done. And a few other things I'll show. So here's that landscape. So this is the southeast flank, right? And the Jemez is this, right, this big volcanic thing with a central caldera. I forgot to mention that. And these lighter colored things are old lake beds for most of the last million years since the caldera eruption formed. This thing has been full of water. So it's like Crater Lake, but much bigger, with multiple big islands sticking out of it that were forested. And so here we are from the Caldera Rim down to the Rio Grande. Headquarters is down here in this canyon. And the dark green is forest. And over the course of, since 1990 or so, we basically developed a little long-term ecological monitoring and research set of stuff here. And this is only some of the stuff, but this is a lot of the key stuff in and adjoining Bandelier. And it was part of a philosophy sort of I actively had about this once I started going on it, of that any park with significant natural resources should develop long-term measurements. And parks are good places to do that. They often have friends groups, funding. Nobody gets 25-year money except for LTER sites, and even they only get it on shorter leashes than that. But if you're physically there, one way or another, you can figure out how to get this stuff done. And we've done that. Kay, who I mentioned earlier, is key to that. At least in terms of the quality. She deserves a lot of credit for the quality, consistency of both the data collection, the QA, QC, putting it in. And I did all this early GIS stuff for my GIS, and it was like, a mainframe, a sixth the size of this room that dissertation GIS was running on up at Los Alamos. But I can't run the GIS. I haven't learned the new software, ARC. But Kay and I sit together, and we can make a lot of things. When we look at the larger landscape, we back out. So here's that larger caldera with land ownership boundaries around it. Here's Bandelier, here's Los Alamos National Laboratory, the two town sites. Forest Service land. It was a big private ranch until 2000, owned by a Texas oilman. It was an old Spanish land grant. This is now actually a Park Service unit, the Valles Caldera National Preserve. And Native American lands, Puebloan, various different little Puebloan nations of hundreds to, I don't know, what Zuni? 2,000 maybe?
8,000.
8,000, yeah. Zuni is probably the biggest of all of them. Well, when the preserve was purchased by the federal government in 2001, it was an experiment in land management. And the first board of trustees asked me if I would help them do some baseline inventory work out there. And we said, well, we might as well turn it into long-term monitoring. And so here's Bandelier with our stuff. Here's the caldera. This is a subset of the stuff at the caldera. I did that from 2001 to spring of 2003, and after the first year I said, this is too much work, you got to hire your own scientist. I just did it as an extra thing, and we did. And so the preserve hired in May of 2003 Bob Parmenter, who had been the site manager for the Sevietta LTER for about 15 years. And Bob is, he's a very entrepreneurial guy, and he's extraordinarily good at facilitating welcoming outside research. So basically, we've been working together all that time, really. And actually all the way from I don't know when I first knew him, late 80s, very end, since when I was working on my dissertation, I'm sure. And so we've created, and we don't actually know of another place like this in Arizona and New Mexico in the Southwest. We're in an upland montane landscape where there's this amount of long-term monitoring and research. Not all of this stuff gets monitored. There's a whole mishmash of stuff here, but a lot of this stuff does. And a lot of it has potential. And it builds on each other. So it's been sort of part of the philosophy from the beginning of doing this. Part of what funded some of that, and then just backing up. So the idea of scaling is the idea I wanted to bring up here, is that we put a lot of work into this particular landscape, and again, long-term, trying to get baseline, make the baseline repeatable, and for some things that are particularly interesting, try to get repeated measurements through time at whatever frequency makes sense. And lots of interesting stories happen because, as you all know, and I've experienced very graphically in this place, the world's not static. Change, it's a dynamic place. Change is the constant thing here. And there's been some huge changes in this landscape, even in my little couple of decade tenure in this place. Anyway, you get some interesting stories, but are those just local anecdotes? Or is it part of some larger pattern? And one of the best ways to figure that out is to scale up and work with like-minded people who have been doing like-minded things elsewhere into larger networks. And of course, there's an immense amount of that going on these days, and it's wonderful to see. Okay? And would encourage you all to think about that. But this has been a good network for me. It's been this Western Mountain Initiative, which was basically the last gasp echoes of the Park Service's Global Change Research Program, which started in the early 90s. But all that money moved in 93, which is, I guess, a little story I should say. What happened here in 93 is that the biological and ecological researchers in the Department of Interior agencies, primarily Fish and Wildlife Service, Park Service, and BLM, were administratively consolidated in a new agency in 1993 by the Secretary of Interior called the National Biological Survey. Some of you here are old enough to remember that. Some of you probably aren't. Some of you aren't even that old, perhaps. It was short-lived. It became politically controversial in kind of the sort of political food fights that we've just lived through one episode of, because there was a perspective on one side of the aisle, as they say, that the National Biological Survey was, the idea of it was to create a biological analog of the U.S. Geological Survey. They didn't have any new money to do it initially, so they just took the biological resources they had in Interior and put it in a different bottle and stuck a different label on it. But they tried to create a new organization with the intent that they would add more resources to it and capacity. And some people viewed it as a threat, that folks like me would find an endangered species in your backyard and you'd never mow your lawn again, kind of a thing. Right? That was the rhetoric. And of course, we're all doing what we were doing before. And anyway, it got involved in budget shutdowns at a national level. And the compromise was to eliminate the National Biological Survey by merging it into USGS, which is why there's close to 2,000 biologists and ecologists in USGS today. So that history. So that happened to me in 1993. I got the call and said, hey, you're going to be you're not working for the Park Service anymore. So since 1993, I've been administratively reporting to a research center up at the red dot. Actually, it is literally right there at Fort Collins, Colorado. Almost there. That's Rocky Mountain National Park, but just east of it. 400 miles away. Maybe I get up there once a year. And at that point, it became a research position, or it was in transition. It wasn't even really till 96 that it became a research position, focused on actually doing research and publishing. Kay and I acted like nothing happened, and we still share an office. And it's a little, of course something happened, but we basically, we've signed an MOU, and we share resources seamlessly between the Park Service and USGS, and we've just continued to make things happen over that time period. That didn't go so well in some other places. Like in Yellowstone, the researchers up in Yellowstone ended up getting crosswise with park management that basically said, we don't have space for you anymore in the park, which is why they're sitting on the Bozeman campus at Montana State. It was kind of a silly move by the Park Service, in my opinion. Anyway, this was some stuff we do in Western Mountain Initiative, and we're still doing this. There's nodes in different places. There's analogs of, like myself here. So this was Jill Barron, Nate Stevenson, Dan Faegre, Dave Peterson, Don McKenzie. Dave used to be Park Service before he was Forest Service. Anyway, we won't talk too much more about that. So this tree ring kind of network site is an example of it, although I don't have the right slide to scale this up. But when you start out at sites, these are individual trees. No, these are actually clusters of trees. And you scale it up. You can go to a mountain range scale. You can go to the whole regional scale. You can go continental. You can start to go global, and people are doing all of that with these things. But anyway, we did a lot of work on this to understand vegetation change, the history of landscape change, vegetation in these landscapes. You have to know something about fire history. We learned a lot about it, and it changed. There were big changes in the system. Basically, that whole Hayman's landscape burned frequently, really permeable to fire. Fire could percolate across all these the landscape, even the high forest types, just some of the highest north-facing slopes having longer return intervals, but 5 to 12-year return intervals basically across that whole mountain range. And that changed in the 1880s and 1890s when railroads hit the foot of the Jemez in 1880. The number of livestock went through the roof in that decade, and we got landscape scale overgrazing of the herbaceous fuels that were apparently the matrix that was allowing fire to percolate across these landscapes as surface fire, but not killing the trees. There was fires like this. We have trees with over 30 fire scars on the individual tree, and the fire scars aren't even burned out, where it was open and exposed to being repeated burned is how flashy and low severity intensity these were. Anyway, and you see these landscapes can flip. So I did a lot of work on these kind of threshold transitions between different veg states. You'd see one site goes through transitions like this in its lifetime. This is in a site. We don't have a photograph of this site, but this site used to do things like this. There's dead Ponderosa pine logs with fire scars on it on a site that looks like this today. How did these things happen? So we spent a lot of time trying to reconstruct this, in part because soil erosion, turns out, was a big issue that emerged at Bandelier in the 80s. When I was doing my dissertation, there was a big archaeological survey going on trying to document these arc sites, which are the archaeological evidences left by the ancestors of the modern Puebloan peoples who lived there, particularly the folks in modern San Ildefonso and Cochiti Pueblo. It's absolutely 100% certain the ancestors of those people were living in what is today this park. But anyway, you'd see all this bare soil in the PJ, and I saw this when I'm doing ecological work. The archaeologists would see similar things when they were out there surveying the arc sites, and we had a meeting, and they were asking, is there anything else you think we should take data on when we're out on these arc sites? And I said, you should look at soil erosion, document it. And this is what that woodland looks like from the air. This is what the drier woodland system looks like. Yeah, again, just a reminder, and these people, the designated Bandelier, the pristine, untrammeled wilderness of Bandelier had between 1,500 and 2,500 people continuously from the late 1200s to the mid-1500s. So, and people were living there. These landscapes, another story, another time, but documented basically the entire demographic history of tree recolonization in places that were apparently deforested by the time they left in 1600. But anyway, they didn't disappear. They're still here, these people. That's Taos, but local Puebloans. These are the documented 3,000 arc sites across the monument. And these red ones are the ones, they didn't have data for all the sites, but when they started to collect it, 90% of the archaeological sites in the woodland zone were being damaged by soil erosion. And so, that was kind of a big deal. So we needed to do some work, and I ran out of time to find the slide showing we, for 21 years, we took a 1 hectare piece of dry hill slope and measured soil runoff and erosion at 3 spatial scales, from 1 square meter runoff plots to 10th hectare plots to the whole 1.09 hectare. Here they're digging out the big pit. This was a particularly expressive intern couple there. But we did an immense amount. It's probably the biggest unpublished data set that I need to do something with here these days. And in the early 90s, by then, we could already see there was an issue, there was management interest. Can we do anything about it? Started doing experiments with restoration treatments. This is Geneva Chong, who I supported a master's thesis work trying all kinds of different ways of, could we reestablish? The thought is that basically once you lose the grass cover on these sites, it's kind of a desertification process, which certainly has happened in parts of Utah as well, and things happen. This is Brian Jacobs, who was a wonderful colleague, vegetation specialist in the park. He oversaw a lot of the vegetation-related studies and the restoration treatments. We ended up treating, anyway, in the end, in the 2000s, first decade of 2000s, from 2007 to 2010, almost 5,000 acres with chainsaws in the Bandelier Wilderness of a national park unit. And it was because we had so much data from both these runoff and erosion and the history of these landscapes from a natural resource side, but also the cultural resource imperative to maintain the resource unimpaired. And you might say, really? You pulled that off? Where were the wilderness people? Where were the environmental people? Well, we invited them out before and showed them the landscape, showed them the work, and asked them, what would you do at the end of the day if it was your responsibility to manage this place? And they said, okay, we won't write you a letter saying you should do this, but we're not going to oppose it. So basically, and we were pretty honest about what the one piece of advice I would give about in terms of scientists interacting with land managers and the public that's been quite effective through the years is just being, well, it's good advice just interacting as humans, being as direct, not just direct and honest, but open and revealing about where the weak points are, where the uncertainties are, the stuff that we think we understand well and the stuff that we're not as sure about. And some people try to hide that stuff, and my experience has been it's actually a lot better to say what you know and then say, well, we got to make decisions, and the best available information, this is what we got. And anyway, and a lot of forest restoration work, because one of the big things that happened when you took these surface fires out of the system, it went from grassy understories to this woodification of these systems and even changes of species, or the overstories, dominant Ponderosa pine, but it's Douglas fir, white fir, and ladder fuels, and the potential for something different to happen in the landscape. And you could see that when I was there in the 80s. All right. And ecologists, this wasn't news. From Weaver in the 40s to Cooper in 1960, well, actually Leopold in 24, you know it was coming, and you could predict pretty clearly that the next time there's a dry period that fire and perhaps tree dieback, like happened in the 50s drought, would happen again. And these are these high elevation grasslands. This is an air photo taken in circa 1990. This, in the 1935 air photos, this is all open. Just a few scattered mother trees through there on this slope up here. So this process, those are grasslands, but that process of infill happened at landscape scale. So it wasn't just a within stand process, it's a landscape scale process, which then allows continuous fuels for high severity fire to propagate. Oh, we've done work on elk and the introduction of elk and exponential growth and the effects of elk on things like aspen, which is an issue throughout the West. And there's interesting things to think about there in terms of what elk populations used to be like. Restoration treatments, a lot of prescribed firework. And then, so this period, so I'm arriving there in, early 1980s. And from 89 on, I'm working for the park and then USGS. And then in 96, we have a near snowless winter, 95, 96. And the world started to behave different quickly. There started to be fires that couldn't be suppressed throughout the region. And that's gone on. Fire is different than this, although, just as an aside, some of the other work we did prior to all this, we reconstructed crown fire histories. In the Southern Rockies, this is work from Ellis Margolis, both his master's and PhD work in first the Southern Rockies and then throughout the Four Corners. Just how widespread fires were in the day, regionally the effects. Paleo-sediment work in the Southern Rockies, including 2 sites in the Jemez, working with Scott Anderson and grad students. There's Scott in the red ball cap at NAU. And basically what you see is that about 9,000 years ago, this is a charcoal concentration by depth in centimeters from one of the 2 bogs, Chihuahueños, same in Alamo. This is a 15,000-year record at the bottom. And basically in the Holocene, early Holocene, charcoal cranks up, and at the top, there's none. Alamo, same as well. It's consistent with the tree ring story. So it looks like this absence of fire in these high-frequency fire systems is a relatively recent phenomenon. I guess there were slides there that are duped, sorry. And then we really started to see it kicking in. These are all, I took all these pictures. Just, all you had to do is be awake and have a camera available in the landscape. So the dome fire in 96, April 96, that first dry winter, things start to go boom. 2 years later, the Oso complex, this is from Los Alamos. I got a great shot of the plutonium facility with the plume coming out of it. I could have sold it to the anti-nuclear activists because it looks for real like the thing is going up. Cerro Grande in 2000, which burned 400 homes and 60% of the lab site. And Las Conchas in 2011, which we'll look at a little bit. Cerro Grande was a big deal. I actually, in terms of marking the events of my career, those 3 fires, the 96 Dome Fire, the 2000 Cerro Grande, and the 2011 Las Conchas, are like major dividers of epochs. 96 burned relationships with Forest Service and Park Service. So a decade before that, we've been trying to work cross-agency, interagency. And 2 individuals got it in their head they wanted to stick a salvage sail in the headwaters of the park. And the Park Service opposed them, and some scientist pointed out why it was inconsistent with their forest plan, and it led to hard feelings. In 2000, the Park Service started as a prescribed fire, the Cerro Grande, here trying, ironically, to protect Los Alamos, and ironically triggered the start of an event, although what you've heard about it is mostly not what the real things. Some things went wrong, for sure. But that fire was such a political... One of the things you learned from that fire, that was in May of 2000. 2000 was a presidential election year, Gore v. Bush. And one of the lessons learned is don't screw up in a presidential election year, because it got politicized in an extreme way very quickly. And Clinton told the Secretary of Interior that somebody's heads had to hang on the wall quickly. It needed to get out of the news. So they removed the people, including the superintendent, Roy Weaver, and Sharice Sidoriak, the chief of resources, that had led that dynamic decade of the 90s. And from that period of stability and growth, the next decade, from 2000 to 2009, that bandolier went through 9 superintendents. Those of you in the university, it'd be like you had 9 deans in 10 years. Something like that. Yeah, okay, thank you. Anyway, Los Alamos in flames, homes burned, people we know. And there was some ecologists saying, well, we needed to do this work, right? I wasn't telling them how to burn it. And fortunately for me, I guess I was away sampling trees with the tree ring lab in the heart of the White Sands Missile Range in some mountains that week. Anyway, and then in 2011, so that changed things. Cerro Grande completely changed what was possible to do at Bandelier for a number of years, and what was even possible to do in the landscape for a number of years. By about 2004, 2005, things had kind of shaken out, and things were functional again. And then in 2011, this tree at 1 p.m. on June 26, 2011, blew down on this little 2-line power line. And this is 2 months later in August. And Bob and I were out here collecting samples off this tree to see if there was any interesting story about this aspen. Nothing particular. It was dated to the 1920s, had a little bit of heart rot, and it blew down in the big wind, and it started the fire here. You see this? This burned. So even after the rains came and it greened up a little bit in August, and within 50 meters it was in the canopy. Within an hour, this was a picture taken from the fire lookout to the south as he was abandoning the lookout, Jeff Dubé. Those are 500-foot flame lengths, at least. You can't see the base of them. They're behind the ridge. It got up and ran and burned 43,000 acres in the first 14 hours. And these are all from that first day run, where it started up at these high elevation, or mid to high, upper mesic mixed conifer forests, burned down into mid elevation through canyons and Ponderosa pine systems, and down even into PJ. Big effects, of course, on hydrology, runoff, and erosion. This was a threshold event from a societal standpoint in terms of trying to pay more attention to hazard fuel treatments. Anyway, flooding completely disrupted park operations for the next 3 years because of the flooding through 2013 in the bottom. This is the mouth of a tributary canyon of Bandelier into the Rio Grande. The Rio Grande was blocked by these debris flows from a couple of these things temporarily. And we don't know, anyway, slow recovery down on the dry end. In the upper end, there's a lot of resprouting plants, everything from aspens and oaks and choke cherries and a lot of things, and little pockets of conifers surviving. But down on this bottom end, this is where I was telling you, Jim, this is the thing. This was the burn severity map showed this as low to moderate. This is 2 months post-fire. You can't, that's moonscaped, all right? This is, a couple years later, this is 4 years later, that's mostly tumbleweed. It's still really slow. But what's happening is favoring clonal resprouting plants. If you want to come back as a plant in the Southwest, clonal resprouting shrub, good plan. Utah's got a lot of it. I think they're the future. So anyway, so this is the landscape. I come in the 80s, and it's this dense forest. You can't see anything. And this is what has happened in that time period. These are the burn severity maps of the forests and with Las Conchas, the whole east flank of the Jemez has been gutted by high severity fire, which are those darker colors. Causes one to be a bit pensive and reflective on time. It's actually disorienting. This fire really hurt. And to me, it felt like failure, because we've been working with land managers. You could see the risk of this coming. We were trying to get in front of it, and we couldn't get there. We couldn't move fast enough. And meanwhile, we got all this infrastructure out here, and all these fires have happened. There's all these natural experiments. This dynamic landscape's happening. There's all these opportunities. A lot of other people are using our data sets. If any of you are looking for good thesis topics, we got some ideas for you. If you're bored in Utah, if you don't need to do it in Utah. Climate variability is a big thing. And so one of the studies, working with Park Williams, we can reconstruct 2,000 years of tree ring history. And I just use this to show, so this is regional tree growth through the Southwest for the back to 1896, where the climate record, instrumental record, is calibrated. And I put this up just to show this time frame of, these are dry periods, so the circa 1900 drought. Above the line is wet, below the line is dry or poor tree growth. So there was this wet period in the early 20th century after the fires stopped. This is when the fire suppression happened in terms of administratively decided 1910 fires. But this is when it functionally happened, after the overgrazing happened. This big window allowed trees to establish all across the region and densify. Some of them died in the 50s drought, but most not. And there's this big wet period. And then here's the dry period starting in 96 we've been in. Things have been dying from different causes. And that's my timeline in there, that green. So I came in this wet, and you could see this, and you could see the risks. And to some extent, my career and the stuff that Jim mentioned, that people know what I've done, has come from just documenting what's happened in this landscape as this transition has happened. But wherever you're working, whatever landscape, stuff like this is coming soon to a landscape near you. No, seriously. And it turns out, though, the worrisome thing is that when you look at this long record of tree growth or forest drought stress, this is back to 81,000, and this is through 2007. That is 2002. And if you look across, there's not another year like that regionally. 2002, objectively, the trees are telling us 2002 was the worst year for tree growth through 2007. This hasn't been updated to get 11, 12, 13, or 18, or 16. There's been some other years that are probably going to be down there when we get a big enough sample set to do it regionally. But the red is a 10-year smooth on it. But drought is normal. This stuff happens, but something different is going on today. This is what 2002 looks like. This was what was happening after Brashears laid out his experiment. And this is what it looked like 18 months later. A lot of you have seen those slides because they got used a lot. But after the needles dropped, that's all pinon. It took out the pinon on the east flank. Whole lot of dynamics going on. We've documented what that is going on. But it wasn't just pinon. It's all up and down the elevational gradient, It's, from junipers and ponderosas and up into white fir and Doug fir up here. But it was also grasses. 2/3 of the dominant grass cover in the PJ woodland, blue grama, died in 0203. Because we got 3 kilometers of transects down there. And shrubs. Bark beetles get the press, and they're important as biotic agents, but drought stress is underlying this. And it turns out it's been going on in Western North America, prominently. In fact, probably in this room, there's people I was talking to. I'm sorry, I don't remember the name, people working on these projects here now. But it turns out it's global as well. And in 2010, I've been sort of since, 04, was putting together dot maps and starting to work with people around the planet. And we put together the first global overview on this. And we see that all forest types, major forest types globally, are showing examples of drought and heat-induced mortality, including tropical moist forests. The Amazon's been really taking it since 2005. There's been 3 major droughts and dieback events since 2005. And it looks like the Amazon may have turned in that time period from a net carbon sink from the atmosphere to a net source, the biggest, most productive piece of forest on the planet. Anyway, this was the first set of maps. Here was an update in 2014. We actually got it in the IPCC report. And it took 3 reports. The first ones, this was a below-the-radar screen project, and I've updated a couple times for a couple different other things. But these are really unsatisfying. We need a remote sensing thing to happen. Now, there's pushback on this in some sense from some foresters, and indeed I acknowledge as well that drought has killed trees. People have paid attention to this before. Is anything new going on? There's no surprise that if you stress to the 50s drought, I've published on it. I just got a paper that just got accepted with a guy in Queensland documenting the same thing in Northeast Australia, that natural drought kills trees as to a large degree. But nonetheless, there are some things different. Somebody mocked this up. This isn't really a science cover. They photoshopped me in there. They thought it was funny, the giraffes with their butt facing me is kind of like... But it took a long time to get people to pay attention to this. It's been actually one of my... Dave Brashears, we've been trying to get well, really? This is kind of a big deal. Forests are important on the planet for all the reasons. You want to know more? Jim will tell you countless reasons. Let me count the ways. And the thing that's different today is the planet's getting warmer. And we won't belabor that or the causes, but warmer temperatures drive multiple disturbance processes. They amplify them. And this is a diagram from one of the last IPCC reports. This is for the Amazon. sort of looking at the interaction. I made these circles of these things: warming, drought, forest fires, tree death, feedback to CO2. This goes on everywhere. We wrote this paper, had an opportunity to make a commentary for the centennial of the Ecological Society of America, and Dave and I in particular said, well, we want to say what we want to say. And anyway, and we still don't know. From my perspective, there's not one vegetation model at a broad spatial scale about the future of vegetation in response to projected climate change that you should believe. Because the mortality process, because nobody gets mortality right. And the modelers have acknowledged that now. And so we're kind of navigating blind so even if the climate models were perfect truth, right? If we knew exactly, we still couldn't predict what's happening. We can't even predict it for any given tree species, really. And there's only a handful that there's even that much physiological data to try to do it. Anyway, we put together some thoughts about some first principle things about this. But anyway, been trying to get a next generation of people. So I'm going to tie this off and just sort of about where am I going now? So I've been trying to pass the torch to a couple of things. I'm actually old enough to be thinking about things like that, including, I've never been an empire builder, but I've been convinced the last couple of years to try to see if it was possible to have another generation of people continue this place-based field station work in northern New Mexico. And so in the last 4 years, been working hard. It was a hard lift. When I was attached to the Fort Collins Science Center here, Fort, in 93, they had 20 field stations across the country. This is now the last field station of this big research center. There's 200 employees, and it's the last one. Anyway, we have succeeded in hiring a dendroecologist, Ellis Margolis, who was a student of Tom Swetnam, longtime director of the Treeing Lab. And Ellis is great, and he has taken this network that we had put together, and he's filled in the holes and has now gridded it, and we are in the process of spatially reconstructing 400 years of fire history in terms of aerial extent of fires. It's also been expanding into the Sangre de Cristos. This is the Jemez. The different colors are different studies that did it, but all these orange ones were Ellis. And to be able to compare to things like Las Conchas, right? So here's the headline: the largest fire in New Mexico history. 156,000 acres. Well, there is the footprint of the Las Conchas fire, even with low severity stuff and whatnot in there. On the Jemez with the fire scar network on it. And there is the year 1801, and all the different colored dots are trees that recorded fire in 1801. The different colors are different intra-ring position, different season perhaps. And you can see essentially the whole mountain range was burning. It looks like every 20 years, pre-1900, there was a fire as big as Las Conchas, and a number of fires that were bigger. Anyway, and then for 2 months now, we're blessed with Jen Stevens, some of you may know, as a new postdoc, but the hope is these two guys are going to keep the thing running as we move forward. This is Key and Jen's out in the field. Oh, and I'm a grandfather as of 3 months ago. What did I say, grandmother? Grandfather? I'm a grandfather. Anyway, this is my daughter and grandson right after he was born, but it's not that I'm done doing stuff, but I'm thinking about what's next. So what's next? I spent 3 months I spent 3 weeks of October in Greece and on a family vacation, and just got back 2 weeks ago, today. And this is at the site of Dodona, or Dodona in English. There's a 3,000-year-old oracle shrine there, centered around an oak tree at this site that the oracles would interpret the rustling of the leaves. So this is kind of a whimsical picture my wife took of me kind of listening. But I did. It was a really quiet day there. There was almost nobody there. I spent a half hour, actually, with the tree. And it was something about it's good to slow down a little bit, be present, be a little more patient, be a little more reflective. I think for me, so I'm at a point this winter I'm going to reflect a lot. But I'm putting this in here for Jim. So this is a closing set of slides. Warming is particularly bad news for what? Big trees, large trees on planet Earth. And I connected those dots almost quantitatively in 2012. I won't talk about these reasons, but you put it together, it's pretty clear that large trees are disproportionately at risk. And as people like Jim have studied and continue to put out, large trees are disproportionately important ecologically. And you see this all over the planet, that big trees die. Now, there's different things going on for different reasons. There's biotic agents here. They don't know this is Atlas cedar in Morocco, but there's big trees include, the tallest organisms, the most massive, the oldest. And they're just, this has been, in this effort to scale up from New Mexico, my home landscape of the Haymans, to the world, I've had opportunities to go around and interact with people all over the planet in these places with big old trees. And it's a huge ecological issue, but it's actually a social issue. It's a cultural issue. Trees, big old trees, have meaning for people. They live so much longer than we do. And so and again, we don't know how much time they've got, but it's not looking real good. And so it's important that people are working on these trees now while they're still here. And so I've had this thought. I'm not sure if I've had it for several years. Yeah, it just goes on and on. But look. And here's our maples back in Wisconsin. These aren't big and old, but they're very cool still. Anyway, last slide. So actually, Brashears and Swetnam and I, 4 years ago now, 4 years ago? At least 4 years ago, put together a proposal at the U of A. There was a pot of money Tom thought we could get a shot at, to put together a workshop to start working on this. A vision for conservation to conserve the greatest trees and forests on Earth. I threw the local communities in there because the idea would be ultimately a bottom-up, not a top-down thing. It would be maybe we could provide some templates, some visions, some ideas, some repositories for information. But to think about the conservation of not just the ecological and scientific values in a natural science, physical science way, but also the human values and the cultural values, because the stories, the elders, these people are blinking out too. And the thought that if you become convinced, as I have, that the trajectory of this planet, and there's so much inertia built into it that, we could change, even if we could snap our fingers, the planet's going to continue to warm for a while, and big old trees are not likely to survive this century in most places, most of them. If you think that most of them are going to be gone in the next decades, what does that say about what we should be doing now? What would our grandchildren wish? What would that little boy of mine wish that we and I had done now while these magnificent organisms are still here? So anyway, that's a thought that I'd like to talk to you some more about sometime. But it's things like this. And so with that, I've tortured you long enough. So thank you. So.